The prairie wind had a way of speaking to those who lived long enough under its breath. It carried the groan of the wooden fence rails, the whistle through the grass that grew high around lonely cabins, and sometimes even the quiet cry of a heart that had lost too much. Folks in the settlement knew the widow's cabin because it sat on the edge of everything, half hidden by cottonwoods that leaned heavy toward the river. They said she lived there because grief had driven her far enough from town, yet not so. Far she was completely gone. The truth was she stayed because she had nowhere else to go. 5 winters had passed since the ground swallowed her husband. He had gone out one bitter morning, an axe in his hand and hope in his chest that the woodpile might grow before the snow got too deep. He never returned. Some said he'd slipped into the river when the ice cracked beneath him. Others whispered of a fever that struck him down deep in the timber. The widow never answered questions. She buried her grief inside the earth of her garden and let her silence do the talking. Loneliness could have eaten her alive, but fate sent 4 small figures stumbling across her path one rain-washed evening. They were children, dark-eyed, thin-boned, and trembling with hunger. Their moccasins were worn to threads, and their little hands clutched each other as if letting go meant death. No words passed between them that night. She opened her door, they crossed her threshold, and the cabin fire spoke for them all. It was a dangerous kindness in those days. Settlers and native tribes lived under the weight of suspicion, old wounds, and fresh fears. Many families would have turned those little ones away, fearing what their presence might bring. Yet the widow fed them, tucked them beneath quilts that smelled of cedar, and listened to the soft sound of their breathing as if it filled a hollow place inside her chest. She did not see orphans of another people. She saw 4 children who needed her as much as she needed them. Seasons turned, and the land watched her promise take root. Every morning she split bread between her hands, half for herself, the rest for the little mouths around her table. She taught them how to lift buckets from the well, how to gather berries without cutting their fingers, how to mend shirts when cloth was scarce. They learned her words slowly, and she learned their laughter quickly. In time, their voices filled the cabin like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Still, there were shadows at her door. Rumors drifted in from town whenever she went for supplies. Some neighbors kept their distance, muttering about how she'd chosen sides she had no business choosing. Others accused her of bringing danger too close, saying one day warriors would come looking for what belonged to them. The widow bore the stares and the whispers in silence, pushing her cart of flour and beans down the dirt road, the 4 children trailing close behind her like ducklings on a creek. 5 years stitched themselves into memory. 5 winters of firewood stacked higher than before. 5 harvests of corn pulled with small, eager hands. 5 birthdays counted not by cakes but by survival. By then, the widow's cabin was no longer the place of grief it once was. It was a home patched together with the rough threads of love and labor. Yet fate, as it often does, had been biding its time. It came on a morning when the sky carried the color of steel and the air hung heavy, as if the earth itself knew what was about to happen. The children had gone to fetch water. The widow bent over her stove, stirring cornmeal, when the first sound reached her, a low rumble, steady as a drum. At first she thought it was thunder, though no storm clouds stretched above. The sound grew louder, sharper, until it was the rhythm of many hooves striking the earth in unison. She stepped outside, the wooden spoon still clutched in her hand, and her eyes widened. Across the open stretch of prairie, riders were cresting the ridge one after another, their silhouettes black against the pale horizon. They came not in 2s or 10s, but in a wave that seemed without end. The children froze by the well, their buckets forgotten, eyes wide with terror. The widow's heart pounded as the riders drew nearer, the ground trembling beneath the weight of so many horses. Spears glinted, feathers caught the wind, and the fox Sound of war cries pierced the morning air. By the time the first line reached the cottonwoods, there were near 100 warriors standing at her door, their faces painted, their voices silent now, their eyes fixed on the small cabin where one widow had dared to shelter 4 orphan children. She did not run. She did not speak. She only tightened her grip on the wooden spoon as if it were a weapon, her body shielding the little ones who clung to her skirt. The air was thick with the smell of horse and leather, with the weight of judgment unspoken. Every second stretched. Long the question hanging like a blade between life and death. Would mercy repay mercy, or had her kindness only called down the storm? The answer stood before her, unreadable, as the 100 warriors held their silence and the widow held her ground. The widow's hand trembled slightly around the spoon, but her eyes stayed firm. The children pressed closer to her, their small bodies half hidden by her skirts, and she could feel their hearts beating as fast as her own. The riders had formed a wide circle around the cabin, their horses stamping the earth, nostrils steaming in the morning chill. It was as if the whole prairie had gone still, waiting for someone to move first. She tried to swallow the dry knot in her throat, but no sound came. The silence was heavier than the roar of hooves that had thundered across the land moments earlier. She could see faces now, painted in reds and blacks, feathers tied into dark braids that lifted with the wind. Their eyes were not wild, not reckless. They were steady, sharp, watching her as though measuring something unseen. The children's breaths came quick. They understood enough to know this moment was unlike the rest. For 5 years the widow had kept them safe, fed them when her own stomach was empty, tucked them into quilts sewn from rags. But she had always known that one day questions would come. She had simply never pictured them arriving like this, in the form of 100 silent warriors on horseback. Her mind slipped back to the first night she had taken the little ones in. Their faces were hollow with hunger, their cheeks streaked with rain. They had been too weak to protest when she pressed bread into their hands, too tired to resist when she spread quilts across them. By morning, they had clung to her table as though it had been theirs all along. She had not known where they came from, nor who their people were. All she knew was that they had lost more than children should ever lose, and that her grief made her understand their silence better than words could. In town, the whispers had started quickly. Folks pointed at the children, muttering about where they belonged. Some accused her of taking what was not hers, of tempting trouble that would one day ride to her door. The widow never answered them. She only walked with her head down, buying flour or salt, while the children gathered close behind. She told herself the world could think what it liked. She had made a choice, and she would not abandon it. Yet now, as she stood facing the circle of warriors, she wondered if her stubbornness had led the children to danger. The riders did not shout or threaten. Their silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that made the air ring in her ears, a silence that meant judgment was near. Her eyes searched for one among them who might speak. Someone older, perhaps, someone who could tell her why they had come. She found none. They sat their horses in rows, shadows and sunlight shifting across their faces, their eyes holding the weight of something ancient. The children tugged at her sleeve, their small hands desperate, their eyes wide. They had grown in her care, but in this moment they looked younger than they ever had, as if the years of safety could vanish with a single breath. The widow's thoughts turned quickly, searching for what she could offer if words failed her. She thought of the bread cooling on her table, of the small garden outside the cabin that the children had tended with their bare hands, of the patched quilts folded neatly on their beds. All she had was built from love and labor, not from wealth or power. If these warriors had come for vengeance, she had nothing to shield the little ones but her own body. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a whisper rose that maybe not all visits were meant for punishment. Perhaps they had come to see for themselves. If the stories were true, Perhaps they wanted to know if a widow had indeed kept their children alive through winters that would have taken them otherwise. The morning stretched longer. The horses shifted, their hooves crushing the frost-bitten grass. She could hear the creek running behind the cottonwoods, its waters slow and cold. Every sound felt sharper than usual, as though the world itself was listening to this standoff. Her memory drifted again, unbidden, to the last spring harvest. The children had laughed as they carried baskets heavy with corn. She remembered their joy when the first green shoots had pushed through the soil, the way they danced barefoot in the dirt. She had watched them grow strong, their skin bronzed by the sun, their laughter breaking open the silence that grief had once sealed her in. Now all of it hung in the balance. One rider near the front shifted slightly, the leather of his saddle creaking. His eyes locked on the children at her side, and his gaze lingered long. The widow felt her stomach tighten. Was he their kin? Did he see in them the shape of someone lost to him? Or did he see only betrayal, a widow who had taken what was not hers to keep? The tension swelled until it was nearly unbearable. The children clung tighter, their breaths quick and shallow. The widow kept her back straight, though her knees begged to weaken. She could not show fear, not now. Her mind wandered to the words her husband once told her on a stormy night long ago. He had said the land remembers kindness, just as it remembers cruelty. He had said people might turn their eyes away, but the land never forgets. She wondered if those words would matter now, if the years of care and sacrifice would speak louder than the rumors whispered in town. Still, no word came from the circle. The warriors held their silence, a silence that grew heavier by the second. It was not empty silence, but the kind that carried weight, as though something waited just beyond the moment. The widow's hand tightened on the spoon until her knuckles turned white. She knew this was no weapon, but it was all she had. She drew the children closer with her other arm, pressing them against her side, letting them feel her strength even as her heart shook inside her chest. The prairie wind moved again, carrying the scent of horse and smoke, carrying with it the feeling that the moment of decision was near. The widow held her breath, her eyes locked on the faces before her, knowing the world she had built in 5 long years stood on the edge of being shattered or spared. She had survived grief. She had survived loneliness. She had survived the whispers of neighbors and the cold of endless winters. But could she survive the judgment of 100 warriors now standing at her door? The children looked up at her, their dark eyes searching her face for an answer she could not give. She smoothed a hand over their heads, her lips pressed tight. Whatever came, she would face it with them. She would not let go. The riders shifted again, 100 horses breathing as one, the riders still holding back whatever words lay behind. Their silence. The widow's chest rose and fell, each breath sharp and careful. The world had narrowed to this single moment, the cabin, the children, the warriors, and the weight of a question that had no answer yet. The sky above remained steel. Gray, the land hushed as though even the earth waited. And in that silence, the widow understood something that sent a deeper chill through her bones. This was not an ending. This was only the beginning of whatever fate had been waiting these long years to bring to her door. The wind shifted again, tugging at the widow's shawl as if the prairie itself was impatient for what would follow. The 100 riders sat steady, their circle closing her in like a noose made of silence. She could feel the children trembling against her, their small hands gripping her skirts as if to anchor themselves to the only safe ground they knew. The widow's mind raced, searching for meaning in the faces before her. Were they enemies? Come to punish her, or kin come to reclaim what she had guarded all these years? A single crow called from a tree beyond the cottonwoods, its cry sharp and lonely. That sound seemed to break something in the air. One of the riders near the front nudged his horse a step forward. He was older than the others, his hair streaked with gray, feathers braided carefully into it. His eyes fixed not on the widow but on the children. He studied them as if he had seen them once before, long ago, and was searching for what time had changed. The widow held her breath. The children pressed tighter, unsure whether to run or stay. The man's gaze lingered, then slid to her. He did not raise his voice, though when he finally spoke, it carried across the silent circle like thunder rolling over open land. You kept them. Just 3 words, yet they sank into her bones. His tone was neither anger nor gratitude. It was something in between, something carved out of years of loss and questions. She opened her mouth, but her voice caught. Her throat was too dry. She wanted to explain, to say she had fed them, clothed them, kept them alive when they might have withered in the cold. But the words refused to come, and in their place only silence stretched. The man's eyes narrowed, waiting. Around him, the other warriors shifted but said nothing. Their faces were masks, unreadable. The widow could sense tension among them, like coals waiting for wind to spark them. Some looked upon her with suspicion, others with something harder. To define that, her memory carried her back to a day 3 winters past, when one of the children had fallen sick with fever. She had sat by the bedside through nights that blurred into each other, feeding the child broth by the spoonful, cooling there, brow with cloth dipped in the well. She remembered praying silently, asking only that the little one's breath keep coming. When the fever broke, the relief had made her weep. To her, these children were not strangers. They were her family now. But could the warriors see that? Or would they see only that she had taken what was not hers? The older man finally pulled back his horse a step, though his gaze never wavered. His silence was more unsettling than any words might have been. The circle held, unbroken, and the widow knew this was no chance encounter. They had come for a reason, though what reason remained cloaked. The children whispered softly in their own tongue, words she had never fully learned, though she knew the sound of their fear. It pierced her heart deeper than any spear. She bent slightly, whispering to them in return, her voice low and steady. Stay with me. Don't move. The prairie stretched endless beyond the riders, yet the cabin felt like the smallest place in the world. Every memory of the past 5 years seemed to press in around her, the laughter, the tears, the long nights of hunger, the mornings when the children had brought her wildflowers just to see her smile. She had built her life on those moments. And now all of it balanced on what the riders would decide. Behind the circle of warriors, smoke curled faintly from the horizon. Perhaps a camp, perhaps a signal. The widow could not tell. But the sight reminded her that this group was not the whole of what might come. More waited, unseen, their judgment ready to fall like a storm. Days earlier, she had overheard townsfolk whispering when she passed through the market. They said the tribes were restless, that old wounds were bleeding again, that settlers had pressed too far into hunting grounds that were not theirs. She had heard it and kept walking, clutching her flour sack tighter. Now those whispers roared in her memory, and she wondered if this moment was part of something larger than her cabin, larger than her life. The older man's gaze fell once more on the children, and for the first time she thought she saw something soften in his eyes. But then another rider stepped forward, younger, fiercer, his face painted in streaks of red. His voice cut through the stillness. Why do you hold them? They belong with their people, not with you. The widow felt the children flinch at the sound. She straightened her shoulders, summoning what strength she had. Her voice was quiet but steady when she answered. They had no one. I gave them food. I gave them shelter. I gave them life. A murmur rippled through the circle, low and sharp, though quickly stilled. The young rider's eyes burned as he stared at her. And what did you take in return? You think love makes them yours? The words struck hard. She looked down at the children pressed against her side. Did she dare answer? Did she dare claim? What her heart already knew, that they were hers in every way that mattered, even if the world refused to see it? The older man raised a hand, silencing the younger. His voice was calm but firm. The children breathe because of her. We cannot deny that. Another ripple passed through the circle, though this one carried no anger. Instead, it felt like the weight of consideration, the burden of choice pressing on every man there. The widow's mind spun. If they took the children, she would be alone again, abandoned to silence. Yet if they left them, would that spark greater anger among their people? Would the act of keeping them tear open wounds deeper than any winter cold could cause? She thought, too, of the townsfolk. If word reached them that 100 warriors had stood at her door, what would they do? Would they turn against her, drive her from the settlement for bringing trouble too near? Would the children ever be safe again, whether with her or without her? The conflict was no longer just at her door. It spread wide between the warriors and herself, between the tribes and the settlers, between loyalty to blood and loyalty to love. The prairie, vast and endless, had shrunk to a place where all these storms met. The children clung tighter, their dark eyes darting from the faces around them to her own. In those eyes, she saw trust. She saw fear. She saw a question that no mother should ever have to answer. The widow steadied her breath, though inside her chest it thundered. This moment, she knew, would not end quickly. It would unfold like a slow storm, each decision pulling heavier clouds across the sky. Whatever came next, her life and theirs would never be the same. The circle of warriors remained unbroken, their silence a wall stronger than stone. The widow, the children, and the riders stood locked in a moment that stretched, carrying with it all the weight of love, blood, and the unforgiving land. The question of who the children belonged to hung in the air, unanswered, as the prairie wind whispered that the real storm had only just begun. The widow's breath felt thin in her chest as the circle of riders closed tighter, their silence pressing, like a storm about to break. She could hear the horses shifting, their hooves grinding the frozen ground, their nostrils steaming in the gray light. The children clung to her still, their small fingers digging into her skirts, their eyes wide with questions she could not answer. She stood tall, though her knees trembled beneath her. 5 years of struggle had carried her to this moment, and she knew it was the edge of everything. The older man with gray in his hair had spoken once, his voice carrying the weight of authority. But now he said nothing, letting the silence stretch longer, as if he wanted the land itself to decide. The younger warrior, the one with red painted across his face, kept his eyes locked on her, anger burning sharp. It was clear he wanted the children taken, no questions asked. His impatience was heavy enough to make the others stir uneasily. Though none spoke yet, the widow's mind raced back to the day she first found the children at her door. She remembered the rain dripping from their hair, their hollow cheeks, the fear in their eyes that softened when she handed them bread. That night, she had made a vow without speaking it. She would keep them safe, no matter what came. And now, with 100 warriors before her, that vow felt heavier than ever. Younger man nudged his horse forward again. His voice rang out sharp, cutting through the cold air. You kept them from their people. You fed them, yes, but you kept them. Do you think your care makes them yours? The widow's voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. I gave them life when no one else would. I gave them a home when they had none. Her words stirred murmurs among the riders. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with something like respect. The older man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not interrupt. The tension between him and the younger warrior was clear, though unspoken. One sought judgment, the other sought understanding. The children pressed closer against her, whispering softly in their own tongue. The widow caught fragments of the words, but not enough to understand. Still, she knew the sound of fear. It was the same sound they had made in their sleep during the early years, when nightmares dragged them back to the night they had lost everything. She bent slightly, smoothing a hand over their heads, whispering, "Stay with me. Do not be afraid." The younger warrior's voice rose again. "If they remain with her, they will forget. They will grow in the ways of settlers, not of their people. Is that what you want?" His words echoed across the circle, and the riders stirred more loudly this time. The older man finally lifted his hand, and the sound died down. His voice came slow, measured, carrying a weight that hushed even the restless. 5 years is not a small time. These children live because she chose to keep them. That cannot be denied. But neither can it be denied that they are of us, and we must ask whether they will return or remain. The widow's heart sank. His words struck like stones, heavy and final. She looked down at the children, their eyes locked on hers, and she felt the gulf widening between love and blood. She could not cross it, yet she could not let it take them from her either. The prairie wind carried a faint smell of smoke again, stronger now. She turned her eyes to the horizon and saw it clearer this time, a column rising against the gray sky. It was not from her chimney. It was far beyond the cottonwoods, perhaps from a camp, perhaps from something more ominous. Whatever it meant, she knew the riders saw it too, for many of their eyes turned in that direction. The land itself seemed to whisper that time was running thin. The children's breaths grew quicker. One tugged at her arm, whispering in their tongue. The widow could not understand the words, but the fear in them was clear. They had known loss before, and they recognized it circling close again. The younger warrior's anger flared. "We waste time with talk. Every moment they stay here, they drift further from us. She has no claim to them. We should take them now." He reached down as though to dismount, and the widow's body reacted before her mind did. She stepped forward. Blocking the children, her shoulders squared, her hand tight around the wooden spoon she still held. It was a foolish weapon, but in her grip it was the only line she could draw. Her voice broke through the air, louder than she had meant, her fear and fury bound together. "You will not take them from me." The words startled even her, but once spoken, they hung heavy. The riders shifted again, their horses restless, their eyes sharper. The younger warrior glared at her with fire in his gaze, but the older man raised his hand once more. His voice cut through the building storm. "Enough." The command carried such weight that even the restless horses stilled. The younger warrior froze, his anger unchecked but restrained by the authority in that single word. The widow's breath came hard, her heart pounding, but she did not step back. She could not. The older man's eyes turned to her once more, steady and piercing. "If you would claim them, then you must face what that means. To keep them is to defy both blood and tradition. To give them up is to break the bond you made. Either path carries weight that cannot be undone." The widow swallowed hard. His words struck deep, for they were true. She had never thought of it in such sharp terms. For 5 years, she had simply lived day by day, feeding, teaching, loving. Now those years had led her to a choice that no one woman should bear. The silence returned, heavier than before. The children clung tighter, their small bodies trembling. The 100 riders waited, their faces unreadable, their patience stretched. The prairie wind whipped colder, tugging at hair, at feathers, at the edges of her shawl. It carried with it the sense that something was about to break. The younger warrior's hand rested on the hilt of his weapon, his glare never leaving her. The older man's gaze stayed firm, weighing her with eyes that seemed to see everything at once, her grief, her love, her stubbornness. The children's eyes were wide, searching hers for strength. The widow's voice trembled when she spoke again, but she forced the words out. I did not plan for this. I only did what I had to do. They were starving, alone, and I could not turn them away. Whatever judgment you carry, I will bear it. But I will not stop fighting for them. Her words fell like stones into water, sending ripples through the circle. The riders shifted again, the sound of leather and hooves filling the still air. The younger warrior's jaw tightened, his anger burning brighter. The older man's expression remained unreadable. Though his silence felt heavier than any reply, the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath. Smoke rose higher on the horizon, the sky pressed low and gray. The horses stamped the ground in restless rhythm. The moment teetered on the edge, every breath drawn sharp, every heart braced for what might come next. The widow stood her ground. The children pressed against her side, the riders encircling them like shadows. The choice hung between them all, heavy as the sky before a storm. The air was thick with suspense, the question of blood and love waiting to break open. The land whispered that the climax was near, that the final moment of decision would come soon. And still no one moved. The circle of riders held still, the tension stretched so tight it felt as if the air itself might tear. The widow stood firm with the children pressed to her side, her hand trembling yet steady enough to shield them. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum in her ears. Then, at last, the older man drew in a slow breath, his eyes never leaving hers. His voice, when it came, was low but carried across the prairie like a solemn bell. You speak with truth. You speak with love. And love cannot be denied. The words broke the silence, and for the first time the widow felt the grip around her. Chest loosened, though only slightly. A younger warrior shifted sharply in his saddle, his anger sparking again. If love alone decides, then what of blood? What of the ties that bind us to our people? Would you have them lost forever? The older man turned his gaze toward him, calm but unyielding. Blood is strong, but love is not weak. These children breathe today because of her. That cannot be taken lightly. A ripple of murmurs ran through the riders. Some nodded faintly. Others frowned, their expressions caught between loyalty and uncertainty. The children pressed even closer, their dark eyes darting from face to face, seeking some sign of what their future would be. The widow's heart ached for them. She had feared this day for years, and now it was here, but the outcome was no longer hers alone to decide. The older man leaned slightly forward in his saddle, his voice directed at her now. Tell us this, widow. If they remain with you, will you teach them who they are? Will you remind them of their people, their ways, their blood? The widow's throat tightened. She had not been prepared for such a question. But she thought of the children's laughter, the way they sometimes whispered old songs to each other, words she did not know but melodies that lingered in the air. She thought of their questions about the world beyond the fields, questions she had never been able to answer fully. And she knew, in her heart, that denying their heritage would be no different than taking it from them. Her voice was soft, but steady. I will tell them all I know, and I will listen when they teach me what I cannot know. I will not let them forget. I only ask to keep them safe, to raise them as my own, until they are ready to choose for themselves. Her words carried a weight born of 5 hard years, and for a long moment no one spoke. The riders shifted again, and the younger warrior's glare burned hotter, but even he did not speak against her. The older man studied her face, searching for doubt, and when he found none, he gave a single slow nod. The circle of horses moved like a tide. Some of the riders pulled back, their expressions unreadable, but their silence was not as heavy as before. The younger warrior spat into the dirt, anger flashing in his eyes, but he did not ride forward again. The widow felt the shift like a sudden gust of wind. And though the storm was not gone, it had begun to pass. The older man raised his hand once more, his voice carrying with the authority of years. She has spoken truth. She has given her vow. The children will remain, but they will not be cut from who they are. One day they will decide their place. Until then, her care has earned respect. The words were final. No one moved to challenge them. The younger warrior's anger smoldered, but he held his tongue. The other riders bowed their heads slightly, acknowledging the judgment. The widow felt her knees weaken with relief, but she did not let it show. She stood tall, holding the children close, her heart pounding with gratitude and exhaustion. The circle began to break. Riders turned their horses slowly, their movements measured, their silence no longer sharp but softened into something more solemn. The older man remained a moment longer, his eyes on the children. For the first time, his expression eased, and the widow thought she saw sorrow there, sorrow mixed with a faint glimmer of peace. Then he, too, turned his horse and rode away, the others following until the prairie was wide and empty again. Silence that followed was different. It was no longer the heavy silence of judgment, but the quiet left after a storm has passed. The widow sank to her knees, gathering the children into her arms. They clung to her fiercely, their tears soaking her shawl, their small voices whispering words she did not understand but felt deep in her heart. She held them tight, whispering back, promising that she would never let go. The smoke on the horizon thinned as the wind shifted, carrying it away. The prairie stretched endless again, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a place of survival, of memory, of bonds that could bend but not break. In the weeks that followed, the widow kept her vow. At night, when the fire burned low, she asked the children to teach her their songs. She listened as they spoke of dreams that carried whispers of the past. She repeated the words slowly, learning their meaning bit by bit, weaving them into the fabric of their days. In return, she taught them the hymns her own husband had once sung, the prayers he had whispered when storms raged. The cabin walls heard the blending of two worlds, a sound both fragile and strong. The townsfolk noticed the riders had come. Whispers spread quickly, sharp with fear, but the widow walked with her head high. When questions rose, she gave no answers, for no one else could understand what had passed on that morning. Some avoided her. Others looked at her with unease, but she did not care. Her life was no longer shaped by their judgment. The children grew stronger with each season. They ran across the fields, their laughter ringing clear. They learned to hunt rabbits with traps and to tend the garden with patient hands. They carried with them the lessons of two worlds, and though they were still young, the widow could already see the strength in them. They would not be torn apart by blood or by love. They would carry both, and they would choose their own path when the time came. The memory of the riders lingered always. Some nights the widow would wake with the sound of hooves echoing in her ears, her heart pounding with fear. But then she would see the children sleeping peacefully beside her, their breath steady, their faces calm, and she would remember the older man's words. Love cannot be denied. Years later, when the children were nearly grown, they would speak often of that morning. They remembered the circle of horses, the painted faces, the silence heavy with judgment. But they remembered, too, the way their guardian had stood in front of them, her shoulders straight, her voice steady, her love unshaken. That memory stayed with them, a light they carried into every choice they made. The widow, older now, sat often by the cabin door, watching the sun sink across the prairie. She saw the children no longer children, but not yet grown, walking side by side, speaking in both tongues, their laughter carrying on the wind. And she knew the path she had chosen, though filled with fear, had been the right one. The story of the widow who fed 4 orphan children and faced 100 warriors became one told in whispers, both in the town and among the tribes. Some told it as a warning, others as a lesson. But for those who lived it, it was not just a tale. It was life itself, carved from loss and stitched with love. And in the quiet of the prairie nights, when the stars stretched endless overhead, the widow would rest her eyes and whisper a prayer of thanks, not for safety, not for ease, but for the strength to have held on when the world demanded she let go. For in the end, love had been stronger than fear, and it was love that had written the final word on the story.